I trust that the reader has been enabled by the preceding chapters to form some conception of the magnificence of the streets of Venice during the course of the 13th and 14th centuries. And I am not aware of any town of wealth and importance in the Middle Ages in which some proof does not exist that, at its period of greatest energy and prosperity, its streets were inwrought with rich sculpture, glowing with colour and with gold. Now, therefore, let the reader go out into any thoroughfare representative in a general and characteristic way of the feeling for domestic architecture in modern times. If in London, walk up and down Harley Street, or Baker Street, or Gower Street, and then, looking upon this picture, and on this, set himself to consider what have been the causes which have induced so vast a change in the European mind. Hello listeners.
This is George.
This is Luke.
This is About Buildings and Cities. This is Ruskin, Part 3.
Part 3.
The final part.
Volume 3 of the Stones of Venice, The Fall. It's the part of the book where Ruskin gets down to the business of what went wrong, what and who is to blame.
Or at least says that's what he's going to do.
The Renaissance, for him, is the root of everything that's wrong in architecture. Kind of perplexingly, for all that, he finds an awful lot to praise in the high Renaissance itself, its masters, Leonardo, Michelangelo. Paradoxically, it's the very perfection of this era that is the real problem. The achievement of perfection, this what he calls the unwholesome demand for perfection, destroys the possibility for meaningful engagement from the less than perfect ordinary craftsman. The architecture of the Renaissance can only be made by great men of genius. It prizes dexterity of touch over tenderness of feeling, and consigns most art to a place where it's technically accomplished but effectively lifeless. He has this quotation that the Renaissance makes plagiarists of its architects, slaves of its workmen, and sybarites of its inhabitants.
Wouldn't mind a spot of sybaritism.
I had to look up what a sybarite is. It's sort of a sensualist.
I thought they were pronounced saberite.
They may well be. I've never heard it read out loud.
I've heard both be said.
Yeah, if you want the long explanation, it's one of the lesser Greek cities.
A veritable Sodom.
They had a reputation for having a good time in matters of the flesh.
Yeah, all of them. No, none specifically.
So I think we're going to have a little chat about this volume. In my abridged edition, it's been cut down to about 20 pages from the original several hundred.
It's about 380, yeah.
And part of the way through, it has this funny footnote which says, apropos of nothing at all, at this point, a 30,000-word essay on Renaissance pride has been omitted.
Yeah, I wonder which one that would be.
It's definitely not the only thing that's been omitted.
I reckon they cut the bit on tombs out. That's quite long.
They cut almost everything out.
I know what the Renaissance pride bit is. It's very boring. Pride of state, they should have called it. That's the technical term. It was an exclusion of a long essay on pride of state, which is gruelingly tedious, yeah.
I mean, the structure of the volume is that it goes through the Renaissance early, high and late.
Again, this is what it purports to do. At the beginning, he says, well, we're going to find out what's gone wrong, why we're with Gower Street. And he says, I'm going to take you through the fall. It starts in the late Gothic. It goes through the early Renaissance, what he calls the Roman Renaissance, through to the grotesque Renaissance. Everything after then has been a lie and has been a falsehood to himself and has been a reflection of a reflection and a plagiarism.
So where are the seeds sown? What's the beginning of this malign process?
So it happens in the Gothic. The Gothic decays. It becomes overwrought. You saw the panel of leaves, and there's another one of columns.
Oh yeah, this is on our Instagram.
And he locates the fall between figures 12 and 13, which are two very similar figure canvas leaves.
Yeah. I think he's right that number 12 is nicer. It's sort of lush. All the leaves are sort of seem to be rippling in the wind. And then the 13th one is similar but looks a little bit kind of emaciated. And then the 14th one is very stylized and looks like a kind of classical acanthus.
It's super abundant. I think he thinks that the late Gothic that people have become too accustomed and they need now like a higher level of stimulation. It's sort of a kind of decadence argument, I think. That aristocrats are no longer hardworking and it's to do with the decline of the state as well. He has an exact date when the rot sets in the state, also in its cultural production, and after then it's this long, slow decline. But the light doesn't just go out. It dwindles and dwindles and is more and more corrupted. And probably the end is like 1800 or something. Just before, like, culture is extinguished just 50 years before he's born or something like that. The first thing to say about this schema is that it's another part of what he's been trying to do all along, which is he's trying to destroy the idea of the classical canon. No one else talks about the Gothic Renaissance. The Gothic Renaissance he's talking about is like Michelangelo through Vanbrugh. The grotesque, when he's talking about the grotesque, it's Michelangelo to sort of Ledoux. It's like part of the Baroque and part of neoclassicism or something. And he's trying to sort of dismember the system. So what he calls the early Renaissance, and he really in that section is talking about Venice, is broadly what we call Renaissance architecture.
But Michelangelo is in the Roman Renaissance as well, isn't he?
He sort of bridges them.
Yes, he sort of ushers in.
He sort of ushers
the
in
dark time,
like kind of the Baroque, right? But he labours a lot to avoid it being the Renaissance, the classical, and the Baroque. He wants the categories to be kind of different to that.
Where does Brunelleschi come in? Is he?
I mean, the real thing is he almost doesn't talk about architecture at all. You really have to piece it together. He occasionally mentions things which kind of give you clues, but overwhelmingly he doesn't talk about. In each of the sections, he doesn't talk about what he says he's going to talk about at all. So in the early Renaissance, he talks about colour and stone. And the early Renaissance buildings in Venice are stupendously beautiful. When you go around, they're absolutely, at least for the first examination, they are some of the most beautiful things. And we're thinking of the very earliest sort of classically inspired palaces. There's one beginning with D, which is the one that like...
Dario.
Palazzo
Dario.
And it is super lovely. He gives four examples of the best buildings of this period.
So let's describe it a little bit. So what's Renaissance about it is that it's got little round arches, doesn't it?
And Corinthian columns, and this is something that's really crucial, strong horizontal banding. So the shift from the world of archivolts to architraves, that's a bad thing. And that he regards as the fundamental difference between Gothic and Classic, which I don't think is totally stupid.
And one of the things about it is that the outside is all marble. It's all these very thin sheets of marble veneer, kind of yellowish, very delicate, very beautiful, sort of soapy look to them. And then it's also decorated by these patterns of roundels. So little marble circles. But you can see also that this has got a real proximity to the Gothic, can't you? These sort of patterns of roundels look a bit like rose windows or something, don't they?
It's very rough, this style. And the beautiful coloured marble facades are very much typical of the style. So there's the famous barrel-vaulted church.
Santa Maria dei Miracoli. And again, they're these veneers, aren't they? Here, some of them are book matched. So it's that thing where you split it and then you open it up so that the two faces mirror one another and create these sort of Rorschach patterns with the veining of the marble.
And he says of this style that these buildings are really lovely. You can learn an enormous amount from the stoneworking of them, which he regards as very precise. But he thinks that they have fallen to the fundamental problems of the Renaissance, which is the desire for precision, which I'm not sure I agree with him on, actually. I think here the decoration is probably as free as it is in a Gothic. I mean, the difference is that the motifs are more classically inspired, or more inspired. I mean, he calls this section the Byzantine Renaissance. And you can kind of see that, although I think that may just be a figment of his imagination as well. The stone is beautiful, the style is wrong, and it's the last flourishing of colour. And he thinks after then, it's all painting. That's the only source of colour, and all the buildings are white. And he then has a big essay on stones and marble. And he says, marble has been providentially laid in the earth by God, so that man may create great works. and it is mostly coloured, so that and partly white. And the white is in small quantity because God has laid it down only to be used for sculpture. And the coloured marble is more abundant and is to be used to cover buildings.
Well, it makes sense.
And it has been portioned up so that there is not too much that it seems base, or too little that it is impossible to use it everywhere. And in putting it on the wall, you don't only give the wall the beauty of its colour, but you also somehow put into the wall the making of the earth, the millions of years, although it's not, the endless time that has gone into like creating this marble is put into the wall, and that's a really good thing. But you can't like this stuff too much because it doesn't have that spirit of carving that he really likes. It doesn't have the Gothic,
the expression of delight in nature.
And he talks a lot about the problem of things going towards painted walls, and great artists working on painted walls no good because they're all going to fall off, and how after this period colour increasingly becomes the preserve of people doing fake marble. Fake marble is a terrible, terrible thing. Painted on finishes are very, very bad. He's a real downer on them. They make a machine into a man. They're even worse than working as a slave because you have to use your mind to prepare it as well. He says even at the clash of the loom, even if you're, working away making fabric, your mind can wander a bit. Whereas if you're carefully preparing painting on fake veins in the marble, you're being completely consumed. And because your veins are fake, they will lack that spirit that the real marble possesses, which it is acquired through sitting in the mountain for so long.
It's blasphemy.
And he says, I know it's expensive to get real marble columns, but it's worth it, basically. Yeah. I mean, he sort of expands it a bit more than that, but not much more. And then that's the end of the Byzantine Renaissance. He doesn't really talk about anything else. Okay. And then we're on to the Roman Renaissance. And with the Roman Renaissance, he says, there are some good buildings in the Roman Renaissance. He almost doesn't talk about any buildings he doesn't like.
Yeah, he does. He talks a lot about how amazing some of them are, and in particular, which is the palace. It's now the Palace of Justice, I think.
Oh, that's true. The appeals court, or something like
the
that.
appeals court. The Palazzo Grimani is the one that he says is best
of this period. Yeah, and here you can really see the horizontals coming in.
I mean, it's a rather harmoniously proportioned, like neoclassical facade. It's got big Corinthian pilasters at the bottom applied to the wall, and then they turn into little attached columns going further up and get slightly sort of lighter in their look.
It's kind of informed by Palladio and Michelangelo, really.
I don't think it's that good.
No, informed by. It doesn't, so are lots of rubbish buildings.
I mean, it's funny that he picks this one to say that it's the best one.
I think it's the best one in, he just can't stand Palladio's church. He just thinks it's dreadful.
This is the famous one on the Giudecca, or on the island next to the Giudecca.
Yeah, the cathedral, which is unbelievably beautiful and also stunning. It's I mean, he's not right about Palladio. Palladio's good. Anyway, this period, he says, the colour's gone. Everything's gone.
It's all white marble now.
All you can take... These buildings are all beautiful, but all you can take from them is order and harmony. And they've made a slave of all the workmen. And he says, into this you could put St. Paul's Cathedral, the works of Wren, St. Peter's. He says they're good works, but they're sort of bad. But he doesn't actually talk about that for very long. Mostly, then, he talks about what's fundamentally wrong in the spirit with the Renaissance. And he has two broad problems with it. One is to do with knowledge and science. And he thinks that science is of no use to an artist. Once you get the idea of science, and by this he sort of means mathematical perspective, but also understanding that the sun is a burning ball of gas 93 million miles away. If you understand that stuff, it will definitely not help you. It's very likely to cause problems. He says knowledge is like food. The best bit about it is acquiring it, is eating it, and that's pleasurable. But once you've eaten it, it's not doing you any good, and it's liable to make you fat and weigh you down. He talks about that, and he kind of mixes his metaphors, and he also says it's like a soldier carrying too much equipment. The best knowledge is like the chainmail of a crusader. Its rivets will chafe at your skin, but it won't stop you from moving.
There is a particular image of the medieval craftsman that is his ideal, which is this person who has an unfeigned and immediate aesthetic contact with the subject that he's representing, which is the book of nature, God's creation.
But he also talks about the two greatest artists of his day, who are Turner and Prout. Prout is mentioned, by the way, in every chapter of this book, and he always says our Prout.
Our Prout. Samuel Prout is a watercolourist. Produces interesting images because they're sort of street scenes with picturesque things going on. But he's not a great artist.
He says that like his perfection is only really achieved because he doesn't understand perspective and doesn't really know anything. And he also says, Turner doesn't need to know how far away the sun is to paint a beautiful sunset. And in fact, the examples he gives in this section are all contemporary to him. They're not at all in the period that he's complaining about. And in fact, in this whole section, he never really talks about the period he's complaining about at all. Anyway, so that's one sort of problem. And there's another category of problem, which is pride. This probably starts in the late Gothic. And it's that the aristocracy are no longer willing to be humble, and they now want to show off.
So in former days, they would have been, stripping their shirts off and helping push the blocks of stone up the hill or whatever.
Yeah, and he quotes Bede. You know, in the Venerable Bede, one of the thanes of, I think, King Oswald, when they're talking about shall we convert to Christianity, says, our life is like a swallow going into a barn, flies in, and it's light, and there is clamour, and then it flies out again, and we don't know where it's come from, we don't know where it's going to. This Christian man says he's got a solution for what goes beyond, and that sounds like it's worth a punt to me. And Ruskin says, you can't have that sort of Christianity in a Renaissance world because the swallow would have to go in the lobby, up 2 flights of stairs, past some flunkies, and into the heated hall. And there's too much comfort, and you're too stripped away from nature, and there's too many flunkies and enfilade progressions, and all of that is getting you away from God.
Yeah, so decadence.
Decadence. And it's sort of got 2 sides, one of which is the decadence of comfort. No longer does the king have his feast amongst his poor folk and warriors on a rush floor. Now he's, surrounded by flunkies and ministers and flatterers. That's in commenting on an essay about stones. He's found an article where someone has written something to the King of Hungary saying, stones are like the classes of man. There are the common stones, which are like the common people and hold buildings up. There are the semi-precious stones, like marble, who are like the middle class, who dress the buildings. And there are the transparent gemstones, which are like the nobility, which you can see through and consequently can be completely without faults. Rather like with knowledge, it's fairly clear to me the reason why he doesn't situate these things happening at a time and a place is that actually they're ever present. The Gothic period is a great period of scholasticism. There is the age of scholasticism, which is, the age of the Dominicans and the early universities and, the reinstatement of the Cassiodorian syllabus. The idea that the court in Paris was any less bedecked with flunkies and flatterers in the 13th century than it was in the 15th century is completely risible.
Yeah. Have you seen their shoes?
Yeah, they went out with the plague, the enormously long, pointy shoes.
Yeah, there's some seriously good fashion.
Right, okay.
Let's talk about the grotesque.
In between, he has a big thing on tombs, which he just loves writing about Venetian tombs. Suffice to say, some of them are good, and some of them are bad, and he'll tell you which is which. But after that, we quit the Renaissance, the Roman Renaissance, and get on to the grotesque Renaissance.
So I think there's something important here because listeners who have made it through to the nature of Gothic somewhere near the end of our last Ruskin episode, you'll recall that the grotesque is also part of the canon of great Gothic qualities. It's a different sort of grotesque that he's going after here, and I think there's something to be sort of teased out about that.
Well, he very conveniently has a plate at the beginning of the section, which has 2 comparisons. On the left-hand side, there are 2 good examples of the grotesque, and on the right-hand side, there are 2 bad examples.
And I can't really understand the difference, but I remember reading the passage, and it's essentially well, the one on the left is the product of a healthy, hard-working intelligence just having a bit of healthy fun, and then the one on the right is the product of an utterly depraved...
They're both lions, lion heads. One is like tortured and rough cut, and one is a sort of boss with a charming little lion licking its lips and its little diddy paws out in front. One, the Gothic one, the rough cut one, is grotesque, like deformity that you see present in life. Something that's very important in his scheme about ornament and decoration. You know, we said it's got to be the thing that God puts in it in life. And in life you have growth, and you have death, and you have smallness, and you have struggle, and that's represented in the grotesque of this slightly tortured face of a lion. And the Renaissance one is like softly comic, and it is a product of pleasure-seeking and frivolity, and it is insubstantial and as an artwork irrelevant because it's not really saying anything. It's just, oh, this is a nice, slightly cartoonish lion. And that's the problem with the grotesque. One is a sort of mockery, a gentle mockery, and one is life is grotesque. We are all like an element of life is grotesque and tortured.
Just of the ones, the two that you've described, it's healthy to acknowledge the dimension of real life, which is grotesque, but it's not healthy to have an attitude of mockery towards.
The one that's mocking it's more like just mocking the idea of the lion. It's not mocking the lion suffering. It's not representing the lion suffering. It's just, here's a funny little...
Okay. So he's against manga.
He's against, like, cute culture.
Yeah. Okay, no kawaii stuff.
And in fact, he is really against it because he says, goes back to his idea of play, and the worst person is the dilettante aristocrat who's playing all the time, and he surrounds himself with things of fun, and to support him you have to have loads and loads of labourers churning out this crap.
Kind of, yeah, enervated by too much pleasure. Oh, he even talks about that famous king of France who... in this sort of desperation towards the end of his life, was said to have had the blood of children transfused into his veins, and he sort of likens that to the spirit of the grotesque Renaissance.
I mean, with that, what he's saying is that it requires an enormous amount of labour and suffering to produce the fripperies of the idle rich.
The problem is not just that, but it's also that the work in itself is contemptible.
But it's both. It is both. The social dimension comes up again and it is important.
Yeah, they're kind of identical, or they're inseparable.
The taxonomies are really boring, but he's got a whole taxonomy of different categories of people who play and what's wrong with them. And then he's got a long conclusion in which he basically waffles on about things he's talked about before. It's kind of worth reading, but it doesn't really shed any light that's not present in other bits of other of his works that we've talked about, I would say.
I think the thing worth saying is that really towards the end he goes back into territory that we've previously encountered in the Seven Lamps, where he tries to become propositional and to say what a Gothic architecture of the present day should be like. You can't really put people in it because contemporary clothes are too ridiculous and they wouldn't look good. What we really need to get into is back into the floral, back into the vegetal.
He struggles for a long time. This is a period of his life, a period of a few years, in which he's struggling to try and work out what the 19th century Gothic will be. And he never really cracks it, and he tries different approaches. Is it going to be an architecture which is entirely composed of angels? Is it going to be an architecture where all surfaces are going to be carved by people who are just told to represent vegetation as they see fit? And for no long period of time, does he ever really find a satisfied solution, and eventually he kind of gives up.
And in fact, right at the end, he has a footnote about All Saints Margaret Street, which we've talked about in one of the bonuses. And he ends with this kind of closing call to arms, in a sense.
This is an appendix near the end of 170 pages of appendices.
Let this be the object of our ambition, and let us begin to approach it not ambitiously, but in all humility, accepting help from the feeblest hands, and the London of the 19th century may yet become as Venice without her despotism, and as Florence without her dispeace. we've already alluded in other episodes to the fact that this book is a real big success and has a big effect, garners an awful lot of fans. An awful lot of young men, predominantly, are extremely inspired by it.
Well, I would say I think this is read by the new burgeoning class of reading women as well, but they don't really have any opportunity to do anything about it because it's the 19th century, and
they've got quite a long time
they're rather held down.
They will be waiting a long time. Two young men, William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones, write a letter which is published in the Oxford and Cambridge magazine.
Still going, I think.
In which they describe Ruskin as the Luther of the arts, talking about the profound reformation which he's going to bring about in culture and taste. Description is to some extent sort of justified, actually, isn't it?
He was unbelievably influential for the next 60 years. He was an absolute titanic figure. He was more famous than Darwin at the height of the controversies, I mean, now people have heard of Ruskin, but he's a slightly marginal figure now. But until probably the First War, he was a real colossus.
And Ruskin became aware of them. He went to visit them at their house in Red Lion Square. And there are these ecstatic diary entries and letters written by Burne-Jones about it. This was obviously very exciting for them. I think maybe should we try and give a bit of an overview of what happens next? So the book comes out during a period when the Gothic revival in architecture is already ongoing.
And actually it's coming out, the 3 volumes come out with a bit of a gap between them. The mega success really comes with the second volume and the hype around the nature of Gothic.
In architecture, the Gothic revival is sort of ongoing, but it enters a series of quite major sort of controversies, becomes highly politicised. There's this famous rumpus over the government offices, which is a commission on Parliament Square for what's now the Foreign Office building. There were lots of competitions around this time. It's kind of interesting. And they all seem to be corrupt as well, in the sense of having an enormous amount of kind of political wrangling and backstage communications of different sorts. The scheme was won by a Gothic scheme by George Gilbert Scott. There was a change of government. The aesthetically reactionary Lord Palmerston came in and insisted that really wouldn't do. And so Gilbert Scott redesigned it as a classical scheme, which is what was eventually built. But in general, the Gothic revival was on the rise. The building of the Manchester Assize Courts, which was this vast, now destroyed building, which was by Alfred Waterhouse, and that sort of marked the extent of the rise of the Gothic revival.
The heyday of the serious Gothic revival, it's sort of the mid 1840s to 1860 maybe. It's a bit earlier than people. It's not this huge swathe of time through the 19th century. It's a quite discrete moment.
So, in those books, obviously, Ruskin had sort of framed the demand for the achievement of a new architecture and for this renewal of society, and they're very much described as if they're the same thing and as if one will naturally imply the other. But very quickly it becomes apparent that actually a Victorian Gothic style can be factory built, railway transported, suburban in location, can be created without any kind of fundamental transformation of the basis of society at all, at least in the way that's sort of envisaged in the Stones of Venice. But so that the phases which I think his project moves through is that immediately after the book there's a kind of demand for Gothic architecture. Then I think that there is a renewed focus on what a proper Gothic architecture might be like, which doesn't have all of the kind of faults and hypocrisies of the actually being built one. Like, for example, the Gilbert Scott's architecture would do square windows for most of the rooms and would do pointy windows in the stairs where it didn't really matter very much and was more practical. And so a kind of an architecture which didn't make those sorts of compromises.
Yeah, if there's something Ruskin's dead against, it's compromise.
And which also, for example, would be much more attentive towards the status of the workman, which is so much a part of the polemic of the nature of Gothic. The Gothic as a style, but also an ethic, becomes a focus in the late 50s, early 60s. And I think that it's probably worth talking about a particular project which Ruskin was involved with to some extent, which was the building of the Museum of Natural History in Oxford, which took place between, I think, 1855 and 1860, and which would be an opportunity to push and try and develop these ideas.
Ruskin at this time is starting to spend more time in Oxford, would go on to teach drawing there.
Yeah, and he would become a professor there in, I think, 1869. So he had a buddy who's this guy, Henry Ackland, who's the professor of medicine, and who was very much within the bureaucracy of the university, was the motive force behind the building a new museum. The museum had already existed since 1850, but in a dispersed way among the various colleges.
This is around the time that Oxford University is going from, it had been a religious institution for a long time, and then in the decades before then, the necessity for all professors to be members of the church and celibate. It's worth saying that removed. And also they no longer had to live in, and they were beginning to expand. It's like at the beginning of the 19th century, they really were teaching the classics, a spot of history, theology. Even at the time, people were thinking this was very backward. And so in the mid 4 decades of the 19th century, this was turned around. New subjects were introduced, culminating in the late 19th century with a university which taught the sort of range of subjects you would expect. So it's in this context of this radical change and expansion of the role of the university that's going on. So all of these new facilities are being required for the teaching of arts and sciences.
And so the brief of the museum was, it kind of displayed the collection, which was obviously a big part of the teaching, and then it also would have facilities for the preservation of specimens and all of these.
Better check the celibacy thing, actually. It doesn't seem to make any sense to me. I remember that being true, but it's not required of Anglican priests, so I don't see what would be required of the professors.
I think we'll just leave it in.
They definitely had to live in halls. They had to live in the colleges.
They had a competition. There's some funny things about the competition I found out. There was a chap called Edward Barry, who's the son of the more famous Charles Barry, who's done the Houses of Parliament, who did 4 entries, which were essentially the same
numbers
plan.
Game, mate. Numbers game.
They were all the same plan, but with different styles of elevation. And it worked because one of them was one of the 2 shortlisted.
Chuck enough spaghetti at the wall, so a little stick.
And the way that they would do, if you think of how these anonymous competitions work, the way that they would do it is that the competition would be known by a sort of Latin aphorism, like a little epithet or whatever. And so there were 2 schemes, the scheme of Barry and the scheme which eventually won, which was that of a young Irish architect called Benjamin Woodward. And
Poor Benjamin Woodward.
Poor Benjamin Woodward, rather long-suffering. He was sickly. He had, not to give anything away, but he had tuberculosis, and he died in 1861, so a year after the museum was completed. He was very ill throughout. So
also died of tuberculosis about 10 years after it was really fashionable.
Poor guy. So Woodward's was known as Nisi Dominus Edificaverit Domum, and Barry's was Fiat Justitia. I don't understand what the first one means.
Doesn't matter. Don't translate it. You just got to assume. You just say it's a very simple piece of Latin.
Yes.
I haven't patronised you with a translation.
And yeah, there were an awful lot of backstage manoeuvres going on the part of Henry Ackland.
What? At the university? Politic?
And Woodward won. Anyway, so Ruskin and Ackland were talking about it throughout the competition, and there are these letters which Ruskin writes which are very revealing of the sorts of conversations which were going on. Essentially, Ackland said to him, well, you're going to have your Gothic building and you can do what you want with it. He has this funny quotation where he says that Mr. Woodward is evidently a person who will allow of suggestion. So it's the idea was clearly that this was a young, naive, pliant Irishman who could be bossed around by the older Mr. Ruskin.
Getting a young guy in without much support on the idea that we can boss him around, that's always worked well in the past.
Yeah. And I guess we should say some things about Woodward's previous career because it's important. So he'd done a few other schemes, and he was extremely Ruskinian. He was very inspired by the Stones of Venice, and in a previous scheme for a museum at Trinity College, Dublin, he essentially had let these workmen, the O'Sheas, who were experts. There were 2, the James and John O'Shea and their nephew Edward Whelan. They were like expert stone carvers, and he basically let them have significant creative autonomy in the carving of the stone, and it had all gone rather well. You know, you can see very clearly that's sort of what the nature of Gothic says that you should do with your workmen.
Colourful characters.
They were colourful characters, and they would...
The lads.
Yeah, they were lads. There's some very funny carvings. There's a carving of theirs at the Kildare Street Club in Dublin. At the base of the columns, it's got a billiards table, a tiny little billiard table, and all of these monkeys playing billiards, which is rather amusing.
It's good fun.
It is fun. It's very well done. So anyway, the museum won the competition. It went on to site, and it seems that Ruskin would interfere, but without really taking responsibility for anything.
He would shove his oar in rather unhelpfully. I mean, what they were trying to do is actually a very interesting and quite daring. In one way, at least, it's very un-Ruskin, which is that it operates, although it is Gothic, it operated at the technological frontier. So the building, it's more or less what's there now. So it's a square around a courtyard. I think 20 years later they had the Pitt Rivers put on the back, which is another great museum, which you should go to. They're both free. There's a big grass patch in front, big stone Gothic facade with gables and some carving. You go in, you're in a glass-roofed courtyard with rows of cast iron columns with beautiful wrought iron decoration, which holds up this Gothic cast iron roof. And then around that, there are Gothic galleries. So there's the ground floor, which I think at the moment you can walk around and you have the history of the earth in rocks and the various dinosaurs and specimens in the middle of this amazing glass, glazed iron space. It was an interesting shape, and they had a great deal of trouble with the ironwork, which is very beautiful and full of plants from various different eras of natural life rendered in the metalwork. That's obviously not the stone Gothic that Ruskin likes. It's a really good space.
Ruskin later would say, I knew from the minute he allowed ironwork, it was all over. But I think that is a bit dishonest, and I think that he's remembering that differently in retrospect from what he thought at the time. Previously, he had said that actually iron might be perfectly allowable in a Gothic building, but it would all depend on whether it was treated according to the kind of ethic of materials that he'd previously articulated for other things. And he seems really to have gone off the ironwork over the choice of colour that it was painted, and then has sort of gradually decided more and more that he was actually against it the whole time.
Miserable old sod. Going back to rereading part 3, I rather enjoyed it and I liked his enthusiasm, but in this thing he really doesn't come off as the good character.
No, actually, I think in his dealings with younger architects, he emerges with very little credit at all, actually. So he would occasionally sort of stick his oar in over various things. He designed a window. I don't know if it was actually built or not, but there is a design for it, which doesn't really look like anything. There's a sort of engraving of it, which was published. It doesn't look that different from the ones which are actually on it.
If you can go onto the Instagram and look at the leaves pattern again, you can see for Ruskin what the difference between brilliant and terrible is pretty fine.
I mean, a lot of the story of the building comes down to the O'Sheas, who had there was a bit of a legend around them.
Yeah, it worth saying. This is what the story. This is the big story told about it. They weren't involved in what I think is the real coup of the building, which is this courtyard, which is the really great bit. This is a story that's really to do with the front and the carvings on the front.
So they were responsible for the carving of the stone, and there are stories told about them, like that the various trustees would come to visit and then would on a subsequent occasion find themselves immortalised as carvings of parrots, on one of the capitals or whatever. They really were given free rein, and they really were very accomplished and very creative stone carvers, but Ruskin couldn't really get on with them.
Yeah, when we say free rein, as in, this is a shape above a window, you've got to fill that with foliage, according to your own desires.
Or, here are the capitals, this, you've got to carve, and they're extremely varied. They'll do all sorts of things. There'll be one that's a fern, there'll be one that's something else.
90% of the things that they were meant to carve are not carved. It's mainly just blank. You can see where the carving was meant to be, but they were stopped fairly early on in the...
Ruskin and I think others, they ran into a problem, which was that they actually wanted two different things from the carving at the same time. One was that they wanted it to be the free expression of the Gothic workman, but they also wanted it to abide by certain norms, like as a supporting element, its form ought to speak to its kind of load-bearing quality, for example, and that if they're too free, there are some of them which are very beautiful, almost kind of going towards the Art Nouveau or something, but they have completely lost any kind of load-bearing connotation, and that in itself was a bit of a violation of some other principle. And Ruskin said of James O'Shea, he was like having a great deal of fun, but that he thought that he had nothing to learn. So you kind of get the sense that at one level he wanted him to express himself, and at another level he got very upset that he wasn't listening to him when he went to give him advice. And so they were kicked off.
They also ran out of money and didn't want to pay them. Building projects always run out of money, and you normally just have to rustle some more up. It was also very political. Lots of people didn't really want in the university the buildings to be built or any carvings to be done. They lost political support because of Ruskin undermining them. And so when there wasn't very much money, so they stopped paying them. They offered then to do it, to finish some of the work for free, and that was refused. I don't think they were treated very well. I think they were treated quite badly. And it was a bit of a fiasco.
I think it's a great shame, because I think that the work that is done works out surprisingly well. Like, I think it vindicates the decision.
Bulk of what they were meant to be carving was on the front of the building, which is now quite plain and has, you can see, like, there's some finished windows and some a bit finished windows. Unfortunately, the ones they finished are right near the top, so there's a lot of garbled stories about it from Oxford.
Yes. In the folk memory,
there's a lot of hearsay in folk memory, which can be largely discounted.
There's a footnote in Kenneth Clarke's The Gothic Revival where he says that he recalls in a lecture standing up and saying correctly that John Ruskin was not the architect of the Oxford Museum of Natural History, and an elderly gentleman standing up, elderly Don, like standing up and calling him a liar.
People were telling me that Ruskin designed it, and it is a load of rubbish. He never designed anything in his life.
There's something where he says that he was in charge of the decoration for a bit. Woodward, in the last 3 years of his life, during the winter, he'd have to go away. So he'd go to like Algeciras or Madeira or whatever to try and get the better of the consumption.
Yeah, you need to dry. Oxford is many things, but it is not a warm and dry environment. It's a lovely building. If you are in Oxford, it's worth a visit, along with the Pitt Rivers behind it. But do take a look. People tend to have heard of the great Pitt Rivers and want to rush straight through the Natural History Museum, and I think that's a bit of a shame.
Yeah, the Pitt Rivers is very interesting as a collection.
It has managed to stave off the great desire for minimalism in museums.
Yes, the great desire to pack up the collection and put it safely out of sight. So something which happens next is that there is like another generation of young Ruskinians, basically. People like J.P. Seddon, E.L. Godwin, William Burges. So they're people who are... When was Ruskin born? Was it 1817? 1819. So they're people who are about, 10 or 15 years younger. And they come with their own sort of critique of the actually existing Gothic revival. So Seddon has this funny line. He notes that Darwin had discovered 537 species in a handful of pond mud.
Probably mainly barnacles, knowing God. So many barnacles, so little time.
And his witticism is that was a trifle compared to the varieties of Victorian architecture. So they criticise its kind of variety, and Godwin has a kind of deeper rebuke, which is that the craftsman of the nature of Gothic is in Victorian architecture replaced by the manufacturer of all of these lovely little glazed tiles, cast elements of different sorts, flying out of the warehouses and into Gothic revival buildings up and down the country. And that was really a violation of the ethic of the Gothic, which, obviously it was as defined. They were accusing architects of having adopted all that was easy and ignored all that was essential.
Well, by Ruskin. It's worth saying Ruskin didn't start the Gothic revival. He gets to define his thing. There were other people who'd say that was never part of it. Would also point out quite reasonably that it never had been.
There's a general sort of debate over what is proper with the Gothic, much more kind of intellectualised criticism that goes on. There are people who, in fact, attack Ruskin for the Italianised nature of the Gothic that he's promoting and how inappropriate that is for England.
Which is a bit unfair because he doesn't really propose to do Venetian Gothic. He says Gothic is the great style of the North, I mean, Ruskin never really coherently has a manifesto.
No, he sort of gestures towards it in different ways. Also, there's a criticism which looks back to Ruskin's text in The Seven Lamps on power, which is about kind of form and massing, and that the Gothic revival has been used to dress these buildings which have no sort of, whose massing is kind of prosaic, regimented, lifeless, and that it's become a way of dressing edges rather than a way of sort of animating forms.
So what does that mean?
They're like oblongs. They're bigger oblongs, and
Like the Doge's Palace, the best Gothic building in the world.
yeah, that's a problematic one, isn't it? That's a problematic fave, because that's not really what he's talking about in the Lamp of Power, is it? He's talking about the great cathedrals. Yes, it's a paradoxical choice, the Doge's Palace, because it's very much an oblong with a sort of frilly collar. They're intellectuals, these guys. So Godwin does a building. He does the north.
Not to be confused with the other Godwin, author of The Lives of the Necromancers and father of Mary Shelley.
No, this is later. I mean, probably, who knows? Maybe related. I don't know enough about him. An interesting figure. He does a town hall in Northampton where the bays are imperceptibly but measurably different sizes.
Ruskin's gone on about how very perceptibly different sizes is very important early in the...
Exactly. But that's the sort of mind that they're in. It should be said that's very much in his early career. So he was in his 30s when he did that. In his later career, he was also very interested in Japanese design. And actually, to cut a long story short, people like him and Burges start to despair of the possibility of doing real Gothic. They write these letters where they say, no matter how I try, it never comes out right. It always looks lifeless. And actually, Godwin moves towards, in his later buildings kind of without style. And he's responsible for this famous house for Whistler, which has this very idiosyncratic, completely blank elevation where it just has windows. It looks a bit like an Adolf Loos house or something, but from the 1870s. Whistler lived in it for 1 year and then had to sell it, I think possibly because of his court case against Ruskin, in fact, because he'd run out of money. and the house was immediately bought and then sort of significantly disfigured, and I think doesn't really exist anymore. But it's a very interesting project. Godwin was a not very prolific, but quite interesting architect.
Hegel was saying a bit before then, the zeitgeist you can only make in your age of your age, and whatever you try and do, it will be that. Yeah. You can fight against it or for it, and both of those will be as much of your time as each other. The first stirrings of the search for the new start pretty early. They start in the 1860s, really.
This is definitely among them.
But it takes a long time to build up its head of steam, and an interesting period to examine the sort of early stirrings, because you see just from what intellectual struggle the modern eventually arises. Yeah. It's a good curative against the excessive sort of emphasis on heroic Corbu, Gideon narrative.
So, I mean, Ruskin basically in the 1860s goes off this kind of project completely, and he says, in the edition of the Stones that came out in 1874, he says, I would rather for my own part that no architect had ever condescended to adopt one of the views suggested in this book, than that any should have made the partial use of it, which has mottled our manufactory chimneys with black and red brick, dignified our banks and drapers' shops with Venetian tracery, and pinched our parish churches into dark and slippery arrangements for the advertisement of cheap-coloured glass and pantiles. And really, he never missed an opportunity to stab a younger Gothic revival architect in the back.
He's a great hater. He hates classicism and he hates everything that is of his time with a burning passion.
And so he would never really returned any of the loyalty which these young men had done.
Have you heard Lars's quote?
No, what's that?
We'll talk about him later. He says, if only we of the digital architects could have managed to hate modernism as well as Ruskin hated classicism.
Oh, Lars, he's a good lad. That's a good line. Within the project of the Stones of Venice, architecture at that point is kind of exhausted. There are these projects which are about trying to work in education and in the production of goods and craft objects in a way which transforms the sort of the condition and the possibilities of the craftsman himself, and creates a kind of alternative way of being and of practicing. Ruskin had been involved in this, I think, since the 1850s. He'd been involved in this
Yeah, or beginning of the 1850s. There's the Guild of St. something or other, isn't there?
Yeah, in the 1850s, he got involved with the Working Men's College as well.
There's a big movement which is not created by Ruskin in any sense.
No, St. Martin's, which is now part of the famous art school, was founded as a night school for kind of young clerks and workers and the like in 1854, I think.
There's a great movement for the providing of education through the 19th century, both for children, but also for people who'd missed out on the opportunity for it when they were young, providing night schools for working people to better themselves.
Ruskin's particular one is he got involved in this thing called the Working Man's College with a guy called F.J. Furnival, and there's a funny quotation about him from Effie, his wife, who described him as an amiable, weak young man, a vegetarian, Christian socialist, and worshipper of men of genius. Which I think is rather amusingly put.
That's a rather on-point piece of character assassination there, isn't it? But
quite funny. Anyway, yes. You get a bit of a sense of her character there. She sounds rather ironic.
She is far too smart for Ruskin. I mean, that was really the problem. You can't do with all these intelligent, independent-minded women around.
The Working Men's College was in Red Lion Square, and Ruskin had been approached essentially to give it his blessing. In fact, he offered to do a drawing course, and he taught regularly there during the 1850s and then occasionally thereafter. So there's a nice description of it, which I think is worth reading out because it makes it sound really fun and inspiring. It's sort of difficult to see what you would get in terms of increased prospects, but maybe it's not all about that. So Thomas Sulman, a wood engraver, recalled how generous he was. He taught each of us separately, studying the capacities of each student. For one pupil, he would put a cairngorm pebble or a fluorspar into a tumbler of water and set him to trace their tangled veins of crimson and amethyst. He brought a case of West Indian birds unstuffed as the collector had stored them, all rubies and emeralds. At other times, it was a splendid Albert Dürer woodcut. He brought for us to examine his marvels of watercolour from Denmark Hill. He would point out the subtleties and felicities in their composition, analysing on a blackboard their line schemes. He had reams of the best stout drawing paper made specially for us, supplying each convenience the little rooms would hold. He commissioned William Hunt of the Old Watercolour Society to paint 2 subjects for the class, and both were masterpieces.
Very nice. I mean, the man was a sturdy paternalist, but you would never knock him for insincerity.
And extreme energy as well is obviously a thing throughout his life. He didn't do anything by halves.
Later on, he more or less set up the Oxford Drawing School, which would eventually become the Oxford Art School, called the Ruskin. And in the 1870s, he was despairing of the effete students. He had them go out and they repaired a road and dug some ditches. Supposedly Oscar Wilde was among them. Lots of stories of people being rather taken aback at these incompetent people trying to supply drainage to...
I imagine they made slow progress.
They made very slow progress, but I think the urge was very earnest. Yeah.
And he had lots and lots of these educational activities which he was involved in. He also taught lots and lots of people by letter. There were lots and lots of them on the go at the same time. Some of them would receive more than 100 letters over the course of their instruction.
Great era of the penny post.
Yeah, and also he would get into kind of correspondence and also form these sorts of relationships with young craftsmen of different sorts. So there's a guy called George Butterworth who was a carpenter. He had a diary and recorded quite a lot of the things which they did together. At one point, Ruskin asked him to show him some carpentry exercises.
Well, the funny thing with Ruskin, though, is he has all this valorising of the craftsman. And he produces a lot of drawings and paintings of his own, of high quality, I would say. I think he's not a bad artist. But whereas various other members produced enormous amounts of stuff, he doesn't seem to have got into the business of acquiring any skills himself. He always instructed through words. He taught drawing through drawings, but he didn't, with architecture, do a great deal of producing drawings himself. And normally when people are dilettante architects, they normally always dip their toes in the old preparation of drawings business. It's interesting that he doesn't seem to have done much of that. It seems peculiar to me. I think there was something which he felt was preventing him, because he worked with other artists. He was a very good draftsman, but whenever he wanted to design something, he would work with someone else and he would tell them sort of what he'd want and they'd sort of try to interpret that. I mean, I think it'd be now is a good time to get on to Morris, his slightly younger contemporary. who was very inspired by him, who's another even richer, in fact, much richer.
They'd made their money without having to do any work. They made a fortuitous loan and bought, well, technically a consul, which is a debt instrument, on some mines.
The worst mines in Cornwall. Worst in the sense of the most people dying in them. But he's a very interesting and attractive 19th century figure who we've talked about at various times. Rather complicated private life. Rather like Ruskin, who also had a rather complicated private life. He is very inspired by Ruskin's message about craft. And unlike Ruskin, he embarks with passion and an honest heart on a succession of developing skills himself. He would spend a few years at one thing, develop that, turn it into a production practice, turn it into a business, and then, he starts at furniture making.
Yeah, essentially because he wanted to fit out his own rooms.
Yes, but then he turns that into a business and he spends 5 years or so at that. He gets involved at tapestry and weaving, develop a real skill and knowledge with that. Then printing, first books at the Kelmscott Press, famous edition of Chaucer, and a very famous edition of The Nature of Gothic. Very beautiful books. Subsequently, gets involved in wallpaper, which is his most enduring product, designing of wallpaper on very much Ruskinian lines in terms of the ornament, famous patterns of...
Well, shall we just describe them a little bit? So they're these patterns which look a little bit like they're derived from medieval tapestry or something.
Well, very, very much
in
derived
terms of
from...
the sort of the pictorial space is very flattened.
Well, he said it should always be 3 inches deep. You can correct me if I got the wrong number of inches, but it's something like that.
Yeah, then they have these very much sort of medieval subjects as well. So these lovely birds kind of flitting around in vines. There's a sort of a delight in the intertwining of the branches of the vegetation and these sorts of things. But also in moving back towards the medieval form of representation, it's also moving a little bit towards abstraction, isn't it? It's moving towards like a quite stripped back...
Some of them are some of the most Ruskinian Gothic things that have ever been made, actually, because they were walking that narrow line where Ruskin, at the beginning of his criticism of the Renaissance, talks about the superfluity of line as being fait and effete. Going back again, it's got to have the lifefulness. It's got to have growth and decay. And it should be between the Baroque or sort of Hellenistic over-articulation, over-plasticity, but also it shouldn't be the flatness of the Byzantine. It's got to be sort of in between. Lifeful, not just naturalistic. That, and also the knowledge that wallpaper is strictly ornamental. It's not an artwork. It's wallpaper. So it's very Ruskinian. The production method is... They're large wood blocks, 600mm square or a metre square. Got a huge roll of paper, you dab it in ink, press it with a foot press, and many of the papers would have dozens, maybe 60 blocks. The ones that I think kept in production rather lower, because obviously each block increases the price, but they're still made today and are very nice.
Yeah, no, I mean, he's a designer of real genius, especially kind of graphically as an illustrator almost, I guess.
The books are very attractive, unbelievably expensive, valuable objects. Not sure I made what I was saying clear, which is that he would start on a project, develop it sort of in his house, developing the skills, learn about inks, learn about cutting and soaking the wood blocks, and then he would hire people to help him do it, and he would sort of show them what he wanted and work with them as well, and really develop these small industries, providing stuff to the expensive department stores. This stuff is literally going straight into Liberty's and becoming Liberty, where it still is, and the books sold on as luxury books, and so it starts as a cottage industry, and then he manages to build them out, and several of these firms are going today, particularly the wallpaper one, but I don't know what happened to the press. He's involved in other things.
Yeah, I mean, he's a contradictory figure because he hated this kind of the flummery of elite taste at the time when he was a young man. Yeah. All of these, this kind of stuff that was in the Great Exhibition.
They were filthy rich.
Yeah, the family?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he
rich.
hated that, and he also had very much like a kind of idealistic young man's belief that art should be by everyone, for everyone, and he hated the machine. He hated like the industrial process and the academy, kind of academic hierarchy of what was proper and what wasn't. all of those things are also sort of intention, isn't it? Because at one level he wants to do and to make and to demonstrate through doing and making the possibility of an alternative.
Really, an alternative society is what he's proposing. He's a dilettante all the way through because he's got loads of money and can build a big house in the suburbs and then can move out and build a different life here and try. But all of these enterprises are entered, I think, in good faith.
At the same time, he sort of wants to set up these industries which have a certain fidelity to proper old-fashioned way of doing things. They're very much sort of early modern workshops, as in something that might have been going on in the 16th century or whatever. And they are in craft traditions. And he very much valued the idea of, and this is something which is continued on, for example, by the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, which is one of the organisations he was involved in. The idea that kind of craft traditions need to be maintained and that expertise needs to be sort of fostered and found a home for and supported as a dimension of heritage. But at the same time, well, when you're making all of this incredibly beautiful wallpaper in this extremely traditional way, then inevitably you're going to have to sell for a lot of money.
Wallpaper really was, I mean, it wasn't developed by him, but it wasn't wallpaper is not an ancient tradition in this country.
No, but the way it's printed is woodblock printing. It's very much the kind of printing which had been going on 500 years earlier, isn't it?
It's a different, the apparatus of printing it is different. It's not, you don't use a press of the sort that he used for book printing.
It's awfully ambiguous in lots of ways, but I think it's hard not to like Morris. He goes into everything with the best intentions. He was incredibly committed, and he would never ask anyone to do anything which he hadn't done himself. Like, literally, he would be there with his sleeves rolled up trying to master all of these things. It's kind of amazing how good he was at it.
It was the centre of his life. He threw all his energies into making things, beautiful things, and he would spend years learning a particular thing. And then Ruskin said, the joy of knowledge is learning it, is getting it. It's like food. For him, the joy was mastering these skills one after another, mastering these techniques, and that was really what he devoted his life to. Once he'd kind of nailed it himself, he wasn't that interested in carrying on.
Certainly in Nicholas Pevsner's famous Pioneers of Modern Design, this kind of return to simplicity, away from this kind of excessive, ornate, towards the kind of simplicity of colour and kind of decorative honesty is the way Pevsner refers to it.
I mean, his stuff is pretty highly wrought, but it starts, I think, or it's at least embarking in the route that the arts and crafts would go towards, which is perhaps not quite peasant virtue, but the virtue of, it's sort of shakery. The craft that Ruskin is thinking of is inlaying things with gold, but slowly that movement becomes more and more about the fairly simple, beautifully made.
And just to finish the thought in Pevsner, that's kind of pointing the way, or that's from where he traces this sort of development of ideas which leads towards modernism and the sort of industrial in architecture and design more generally. I think that there's an afterlife of these ideas which kind of keeps on, what's it called, the Guild of Handicraft. There are subsequent figures who come after Morris and who attempt to create these like cooperative communities of people.
It becomes that big arts and crafts movement.
When you get into the foundation of the Society of Arts and Crafts in the 1880s, I think, that you're starting to get...
This stuff goes right through to the 20s, I think.
But you can see between craft skill and making and this opposition to, initially as complete opposition to, and latterly as a sort of focus on and thinking critically about the nature of industrialised production, you can see this sort of dialectical movement which is going to lead towards eventually design as harnessing the potential of the machine, of industrialised forces, and of things like the Deutsche Werkbund, and then subsequently the Bauhaus and all of these other things.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, kind of. There were other things as well. If you think of, I mean, the Great Exhibition is 1850, I keep getting it wrong, one?
I think so, yeah.
And you think of the foundations of V&A. I mean, this is sort of going on in parallel and before, the trying to get all this knowledge out, to get it into, trying to get beauty into industry. You can make the line.
I think what's absent from the stuff that's in the Great Exhibition is that, yeah, sure, it's about let's get beauty into industry, but
Let's make enormous aluminium statues of
enormous aluminium statues, or let's make all of these things which are sort of gold and covered in fake pearls or whatever.
terrible paintings. Yeah,
The thing which is novel and which emerges out of the dynamic of arts and crafts is to think about a way of trying to reconcile craft and industry in a way which produces these objects which are often quite simple but kind of crafted, and which are much more critically about what's the potential of the process of production.
I think he feeds into it, but I also think there were people in parallel. The industrialists who wanted to make their factories like temples also wanted to make the things they were making. People are working from both ends, I think. Yeah, so there's another thing they were doing. Ruskin, it's like 30-odd volumes, 30-something volumes, 7 modern painters, 3 Stones of Venice, 1 Lamps of Architecture, unto this last, and then there's like a million other things. Ooh.
Yeah, there's a lot of speeches, because he would give 3 or 4 speeches and they would all be published, 3 or 4 a year normally, so that's a big part of it. I should say there's a nice quotation from a letter by Ruskin which frames the slightly conflicted nature of political ideology. In response to a letter which asks whether he was a socialist, he said, "Of course, I am a socialist of the sternest sort, but I am also a Tory of the sternest sort."
He believes that there's a naturally ordained hierarchy in society. He believes in the class structure. He doesn't think that necessarily the right people are in the right classes.
Well, the thing he isn't is a liberal. That's important.
He's certainly not a liberal. He believes in supporting the worthy poor. He believes in social order.
A lot of this filters into his work on political economy, Unto This Last, which was published, I think, as a series of 4 articles. The book is about political economy, and certainly the first part of it is really about attacking the basis on which political economists kind of imagine the action and interaction of people as rational economic actors. People are sort of motivated by the profit motive, and he has lots of counterexamples. He has this kind of obvious, poignant example of the starving mother and children who come into the possession of a crust of bread. According to the theories of political economy, they must fight over it, and she will be victorious and will eat it herself. But of course, that's not really what you would expect to happen in the situation. And then he has lots of other examples. He likes to talk about people in the army, like the care that an officer has for his men in the army, or of a master and his servants, which is kind of getting, I think, very much at the sort of Tory socialist angle. But really to undermine that idea and to say that really the basis...
Tory paternalist. His politics were paternalist.
In the introduction, which is written subsequently, he also responds to some things that people have sent in. Well, so someone says to him, well, what do you think you should do? And he says, I think essentially he comes out in favour of the nationalisation of all industry, national education, and nationalisation of all industry, and everyone should get a job. Everyone should have a job that wants one, but also it's kind of strongly implied that they'll have a job which is suitable for them and places them at the appropriate station for their capacities.
And he also wants the nationalisation of industry so people don't build any more railways and people aren't going about. He says that explicitly. He also says in another place he wants the nationalisation of industry so there isn't so much of it. People have used that quote about nationalising industry to make him into much more of a socialist, saying that you want everyone to work in state industry, saying that you want everyone to work for the state and the state to provide a job for everyone, is something that socialists, certain hues of socialists would support, but not for the reasons that he wants. Partly it's because he hates everything new and he wants the state to stop them. Partly it's because he wants complete control, and partly it's because he wants this ordered...
He's not keen on modern life.
No.
In lots of ways. I'll give a bit of an account of it. The different chapters move through different things. The first bit is about the nature of kind of exchange, and the essentially making the case relatively successfully that cooperation is often a much stronger motive than competition. And at another point he sort of talks about wealth. What does wealth consist in? And he's obviously making the point that wealth depends on other people's desire to own it, that the value of anything is sort of determined in large part by the fact that other people want it from you. If you're the last man, then the possession of all the gold in the world is not a hugely kind of meaningful thing. He talks about it as the possession of the valuable by the valiant, which I'm not quite sure what that bit is about.
If you're not worthy, if you're not the right sort of person, you're not really wealthy. Yeah. Because, one, you won't go to heaven, and two, you won't really enjoy it. Yeah. He thinks a rich person who doesn't give money to the poor is only doing it because they are deceived by themselves. And he says in the Stones of Venice that we believe in ourselves that money is good, but really we are deceived, rather as we're deceived into liking classicism, and we're deceived into avarice.
Yeah. Another part, he sort of talks about the nature of exchange, and he very much goes into this language of morality, which we've become very familiar with, where he essentially makes the case that either you're paying the fair price for something or you're not, and that if you're getting a bargain, you're essentially not swapping like for like. And he has this parable of the two sailors who get shipwrecked on an island and have to exchange. They have to make exchange, and what would be a fair exchange for them to make? And he comes to the conclusion that essentially the only fair exchange is an entirely equivalent exchange of labour power for labour power. So if I give you something which took me 2 hours to make and you exchange it for something that took you 1 hour to make, you are exploiting me, and it's immoral.
Yes, he doesn't think that the aristocrats should have loads more money than everybody else. He just thinks that they should rule. Yeah. But he also lived entirely off money from his dad and then inherited money his entire life. He never made any money by labour himself. It was either royalties, which are not at all like that. They're like, has no relationship to labour, or it was inherited, in which case it was capital.
Yes, he has. I would say he is rather down on the merchants. And let me read this quote. 5 great intellectual professions relating to the daily necessities of life have hitherto existed. 3 exist necessarily in every civilized nation. The soldier's profession is to defend it, the pastor's to teach it, the physicians to keep it in health, the lawyers to enforce justice in it, the merchants to provide for it. And the duty of all these men is, on due occasion, to die for it. On due occasion, namely, the soldier, rather than leave his post in battle, the physician, rather than leave his post in plague, the pastor, rather than teach falsehood, with a capital F, the lawyer, rather than countenance injustice, with a capital I, the merchant. But what is his due occasion of death? It is the main question of the merchant, as for all of us, for truly, the man who does not know when to die does not know how to live.
Yeah, well, I mean, his family made all their money in trade, didn't they?
I don't know if this was directed at John James Ruskin, the father. I mean, I think that the enjoyment of this book is that he does. I think one of the things that Ruskin is good at is he's good at caricaturing and kind of mercilessly exposing the hypocrisy of various sort of commonly held views and beliefs. And I think that that's what the better parts of this text are really animated by that, and that's the enjoyment of them. And I think that that's something really he'd got from Carlyle, actually, isn't it? It kind of comes all the way down from that. I think in parts of this very much read...
Carlyle's also down on the merchants, but Carlyle wasn't a merchant.
No.
Yeah, wouldn't get his money.
He was a pastor.
He got his money from the old order.
And we might say, I mean, should we say something about Morris as well? Because there are these later texts which Morris himself did.
I don't think we can do them justice here. We may talk about them at some point in the distant future, but one of his great sort of flourishings, along with flourishing of printing or a flourishing of furniture, is a flourishing of socialism and social political agitation.
I wanted to say one thing about it, which is that this kind of elliptical vision of what he thinks the future should be like, this nationalised industry and national education system that Ruskin gives in his introduction. Well, I may be wrong about this, but it strikes me that it seems to be picked up pretty strongly by a subsequent author, a guy called Edward Bellamy, who's an American who wrote a book called Looking Backwards, year 2000 to 1887, which was the year in which he'd written it, which became this prodigiously successful science fiction. I think it was like the second most successful novel ever in the United States.
We should do that in the future. It's good.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting.
Very interesting.
And it's interesting. It's not a great read, but it is kind of fun. And
don't be expecting it anytime soon.
No. Well, you never know. I think that we sort of should finish the arc of Ruskin's life. I mean, he lives a lot longer. He lives until 1901 or something. But I think by that time he's still incredibly influential, but people really felt a little oppressed by him.
I mean, actually, I would say in popular terms, he is more influential than ever. He's gone from being avant-garde to being establishment. He's teaching in Oxford for a long time. Eventually he buys and extends a house. I think it's in the Lakes. Can we look it up, because it's an important bit of information. But he spends it has a viewing thing where you can look out over the lakes and comes back into Christ.
Oh yes, because he'd had a wobble, hadn't he? He'd managed successfully to sublimate his sexual attraction to little girls into various other sorts of activity, but at a certain point it broke through and destroyed his faith in God.
Yeah, but also, actually, I also think he, like a lot of 19th century people, was struggling with the scientific revolution and struggling with geology and Darwin, and I think with a mental breakdown and depression. I think he got depressed and ceased to see the world and its surroundings as being fundamentally imbued with goodly godliness. The death of Rose Latouche, I think, was very difficult for him. But eventually he went to a séance, and he got in touch with her spirit, and her spirit showed him the way back to Christ. I mean, he's a bit of an eccentric Christian in later life.
The house, by the way, is called Brantwood, and it's on Coniston Water, so this is one of the big lakes in the Lake District.
But he spent a lot of time walking around there, and he was very involved in a girls' school, engaged in teaching the girls about sort of nature and the wonders of life. He didn't interfere with them. I don't have any truck with him, actually. I don't think there was certainly no hanky-panky, and I don't think there was any inappropriate behaviour, but it was a bit strange for this very old man to be spending quite so much time at the girls' school. But he enjoyed, I think, very much teaching them, being a sort of father figure to them, and teaching them about how the mountains are alive and how the spirit moves in the waters, and we must all dance around like angels. I think the father, he's a paternalist, but I think that's also the relationship that he could do. I think that's the sort of human relationship he could do. He could be warm and show genuine interest in people's education and try and share his delight in various things in the world with people. That was what he was good at. He wasn't good at most of the other adult relationships. I
mean, at the time of his death, I think people were ready to leave him behind. In the book,
some were. He went on to be very successful he was very, very influential for sort of 15 years after his life.
In the book I've been reading, John Ruskin in Victorian Architecture, there's a reminiscence by an architect called Henry Wilson, who says, "There came a sudden clamour outside. The door burst open, and another well-known artist rushed in dancing and frantically waving an evening paper. 'Ruskin's dead! Ruskin's dead!' he cried, then, sinking into a chair. 'Thank God! Ruskin's dead! Give me a cigarette.'"
He was a bit of a dead weight on the heart of culture, wasn't he, by then?
There's a review in an article, I think without a byline, in the Architectural Review from 1907, which says, "One wonders a little how much real influence Ruskin, has on the architectural student of today. Probably very little, which is easily understood, but unfortunate. The present writer was once a devout Ruskinian, and abjured Wren and all his works as savouring of the pit. Pure bigotry, of course, and easy to laugh at 20 years later. It may be doubted, however, whether an ultimate wide appreciation of the best in all architecture is not in fact fostered by earlier extravagances based on Ruskin taken neat. Ruskin's teachings may be démodés, but his spirit remains and will remain." And there's a nice little line from Richard Norman Shaw, who we've described before, saying of Ruskin's work, "Every word I believe to be fallacious, but I read it with pleasure and lay it down with regret." I
think I'd go with that, really. I mean, he's someone you fall in and out of love with very quickly. because he's got something which I love in people when I meet them, which is a real passion for art and buildings and things. And that's lovely to people, and he's really fired up, and he's very bright, but he's also very wrong. Not about everything, and he has genuine and brilliant insights. And he contributed meaningfully to our culture, I think. Great man, but also wrote a lot of guff.
I think there's a kind of passionate and sort of reverential mode of looking and thinking, an eye which kind of notices and is sort of drawn into the inner hidden life of things. And I think it's a wonderful thing to step inside. That's the thing which his writing still does for me, is it can take you into a kind of an amazing place and in a sort of revelatory way of looking at the world, at the things that surround us.
God, I really feel his nostalgia as well. I wish I went to Venice in the 1830s, before they built the bridge. I wish I was there. Seems amazingly nostalgic. He died in 1901, the young whippersnappers of the Edwardian, boating, pleasure and fun. And then, really, the world of Ruskin died in the First World War. And the shock of the new. But you can see, however obliquely, and we've been discussing with Morris and others, how in essence that the groundwork of the shock of the new is present. Even in this extraordinarily conservative man, he is part of that movement that leads towards the English free building part, which kind of goes on to inform the arts and crafts, which goes on to inform the craft production, which can go on into, Behrens or Mies. He's laid down a real influence, as much as it's unseen and now forth removed.
Well, I mean, even the famously this woodcut made to announce the launching of the Bauhaus shows not a factory but a cathedral,
and a kind of Gothic cathedral.
I mean, it's a bit of an illusion that we're making, but
there is a connection. It's a complicated, winding one. But his dream world, which then becomes the dream world of Morris, does sort of drift into those dreams of the great utopias as well.
Remember that our Patreon is at patreon.com/about_buildings. You can follow us on social media at about_buildings.
And listeners on that who subscribe on that Patreon, listeners potentially just like you, are paying for our brilliant, talented new editor. Well, not all that new by the time this comes out. Matthew Lloyd Roberts.
Yes.
Plural. I'm terrible with names. Who will have edited this episode into something far better than we produced. Thank you to all of you, and thank you to Matt.
So thanks a lot for listening.
Good night.
All the best.
Goodbye.